For the next hour, we want to have a conversation about our public wage bill. So this has been there for a while. Oh, you know, our wage bill is way beyond what is stipulated in law. You know, counties have just become, what are they called? Employment bureaus. You know, if you want a job, you get a job in government. If you're a politician and you're not getting people to work for government, what are you doing? We'll send you home. Is our public wage bill sustainable? Is it not? That's why we have invited the chairperson of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, Madam LYN MENGICH, to be our guests. Good morning.
Good morning.
It doesn't matter whether it's June, July, it's January, February, or April. If we are seeing you for the first time, we say Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
How are you doing?
I'm fine.
You're pushing on well?
Yes, please.
Very good. Siti, why don't you welcome the chairperson with the day's proverb? Tell her where the proverbs for this week will come from.
Our proverbs for the whole of this week come from the Republic of the Senegal. Yes, an interesting country. As I said in the first hour in the morning, this is one of those few countries on the continent who've never had a coup. They've never had a coup. Countries on this continent can be categorized into three. Those who've had successful coup attempts, meaning the government was overthrown, and usually by the military. There are those like Kenya who have had an attempted coup which really didn't go, it just fizzled out. Then there are those who've never had a coup. As you can guess, the countries that have never had a coup are few. Okay. Right. The proverb for the day. Trusting in wealth is like looking for feathers in a turtle.
Trusting in wealth is like looking for feathers in a turtle.
Yes.
You know, what's the interpretation of this proverb?
Well, it's a difficult one, but it's really saying, I mean, turtles don't have feathers to start with. So you're looking for wealth, you'll not find. Yeah. If that's your objective in life, you'll not find.
You'll not find it.
Yeah.
What do you think the inner meaning of this would be?
It really says we should not be pursuing wealth as our core. Because we'll not find it. But there are other things we ought to be thinking about. Yes.
It's more looking for the other things, City.
Consider, we talk of development in terms of value addition, adding value. Now, adding value is what builds commerce, what builds industry, and the consequential effect of all these activities is that there's more money available, there's more money in circulation, more people are able to either do business with the enterprises or get work. So this situation that we talk about, and in this country it's a national song, it's called unemployment, you see it being addressed as these things continue. But if you're just pursuing money for money's sake, it's what brings about money that ought to be the focus, the things that you need to do so that this thing is generated. Because now that is what now brings about another word we have in Kenya called sustainable. You have then something that is sustainable and over time can actually grow. Yes.
Good one. But MENGICH, we have something in our constitution and statute called public finance management, right? And the one thing that is big about our constitution is that it actually went and put it in the constitution how our money shall be managed and prudently. And also then it talked about who shall be the gatekeepers of how our money is spent. You know, we have the Auditor General, we have the Controller of Budget, and we also created now the Salaries and Remuneration Commission that says, okay, wage bill is one of the big factors in public finance management. We shall have a commission that looks holistically at our wage bill and makes sure that we are getting the right people for the right jobs, that we are getting the right services from the right people in the right jobs, and that we shall not overpay, such that all our money plus debt goes into this. This has been a daunting task, hasn't it? Because even the last time you were here, we were talking about the challenge of the SRC in trying to make sure that you bring our public wage bill to what is stipulated in law, 35% and below. What is it right now? What percentage is it?
Well, for 2022-23, we're really projecting it will be at around 43% of revenue.
43% of what revenue? Of that
ordinary
year's
revenue. But that's projected 2022-23. But we actually go for the actual, which is already audited. It's at 47%, which is now the 2021-22 financial year. So that's where we are. But as you rightly say, that's against the PFM regulation target of 35, not more than 35%. Yes, so that's where we are.
How did we get to 47%?
Well, there's been, first of all, wage bill is really a factor of two things. It's one is revenue itself, and then obviously the absolute wage bill in amount. So if we look at the wage bill in absolute amount, it has actually been growing even faster than that 47%. But then because revenue is also growing, then obviously when you do the ratio, that's where we get to that 47 now projected to 43%. So how did we get there? How did we get there? First is we're a developing country with a growing population. And therefore we must rightly so spend on key and critical services, notably healthcare, education, and security. So we have been actually growing those sectors as it should be. I must add, as we speak, we have not attained the WHO ratio for healthcare worker to population. Neither have we attained the required ratios for teacher to student ratio. Even security, we are still below. So the real challenge we have here is a growing population. We must continue to recruit to be able to service the citizens. And remember, the Constitution also says that every citizen has a right to access these services. So that the government must continue doing so. And as we do so, the challenge therefore is, are we growing our revenue faster than we are growing our wage bill? So the real conversation is about, are we outpacing economic growth in the way we are growing the wage bill? But in absolute amount, I must say we must continue growing the wage bill. So that really is the balance that we ought to have as a country. That notwithstanding, it's not saying there are no things we could do about our current wage bill. Obviously, we see wastage there. But overall, you can actually see that we must balance the two.
Okay. So maybe I try to understand this in maybe a basic manner so that folks can also hear. We are saying that for every 100 shillings, for example, that comes into the country, 35 of those shillings should go towards paying those who work for government, who are state officers, etc., etc. But we've surpassed that amount. And we also, are we saying the reasons why we've surpassed that amount is because as an economy grows, there are certain things then that you must cater to. You must make sure that you're hiring enough health workers, etc. Were these not taken into consideration when the PFM Act was being established? Knowing that Kenya is a developing nation, understanding that these things need to be done, why would they leave that number at 35%, knowing full well that there would need to be an increase in how much you spend because you need to cater to the needs of a growing or developing nation?
Well, you see, it's an aspirational target because when you look at a number, then you also have to base it on what are other countries doing, right? What are the ratios? For example, when we look at Kenya and compare with developing countries, as a ratio of GDP, we should not be more than 7%, right? But we are more than that. So this 35% was really informed by what are the global trends. Now that assumes that as you rightly so increase access to services, you are also increasing your economic growth. So really there are assumptions there that you may not always achieve. And that's why I go back to our real challenge is, are we productive as a nation? Because if we are productive, then we would not be having the challenge that we have today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for when we say productive, what we're talking about, I'm assuming, is that there is manufacturing, that your exports at the very least balance with or surpass your imports, and that you're producing and selling for profit as a nation. Is that what you mean by productive?
Yes, those are some of the indicators. But the way productivity is calculated is you take your GDP and divide by the number of your workers. So it measures your labor productivity. It measures your output per worker. But you're right in saying what informs that. What are the fundamentals when we talk about productivity? Let me use the public service as a clear example. How can we be more productive in the public service, right? So we're talking about value for money. Being able to do more with less. For commercial state corporations, for example, we are saying, are these state corporations actually remitting the dividends to the treasury as required? Are they actually producing that? For the non-commercial, they ought to reduce their reliance on exchequer, because all these state corporations were actually formed, some of them commercial, some are not commercial.
Yep.
But their reliance to exchequer ought to reduce. And for the others, they ought to have more revenue out of what they are doing. That's productivity. Look at the county governments. What would productivity look like? It will mean that they increase their own source revenue, so that there is less reliance on the shareable revenue from the national government. But what we see today is there are very few counties that are actually generating more on-source revenue. Very few indeed are hitting their targets, their own targets on on-source revenue. That tells you productivity there's a problem there. As another example in the public service where productivity comes in is, if you're productive, we would not need the numbers that we need today. You would need less people to deliver the same. And therefore, even with the numbers that we have, we ought to do much, much more. So that's speaking now to productivity as a nation. And just to share with you, to say, really, we compare Africa, ourselves in Africa. We are ranked 22, out of 45. What does it tell us? We pride ourselves as having the best talent. And I do agree we have the best talent. So why are we number 22 in Africa? Right? Why are we not number 1, number 2, number 3? There is something that says our productivity is not where it ought to be.
So what is it? Is it an attitude? Okay, you're a HR professional. What are the hallmarks of a productive worker?
There are two elements here. One is how we manage our performance and productivity in the workplace, right? And I will explain that a little bit. The other one is our own culture. What is our culture like, right? The other element is leadership, because leadership is at the core of being productive as a nation. There will be other levers, for example, our use of technology. Have we embraced technology to the level at which we should be? So just to speak very quickly on those, if we look at our performance management in the public service, we were one of the first in the Commonwealth to roll out our performance contracting, a very beautiful tool, and got an award from the Commonwealth. A few years later, some countries, India for example, they came, Kenya, they borrowed it, implemented it very well.
They came to benchmark here.
They benchmark. And what they shared with us in our last wage bill conference is that by implementing that tool, almost all their state corporations have generated much more income than they used to. What did they do differently that we haven't done? One is, what are we measuring in our performance management? Are we measuring outcomes or are we measuring processes? So if you get your targets wrong, you're measuring the wrong things, you will not get very far. So for a very long time, our measurements are not productivity measurements. Right? You're measuring how you're doing things as opposed to measuring what is the outcome and the impact of what you're doing. So that's one area that needs to be.
Sorry, just give us an example of that. We in Kenya seem to have focused more on the processes, right? In our performance management contracting. India, when they came and borrowed, they identified, let's go for what comes out of it, the outputs and the outcomes. Show us the processes that, for example, our performance contracting seems to focus on.
Let me give you an example of, if you're talking about citizen centricity, you want to deliver to the citizens today. When you measure your performance, if you're looking at productivity metrics, I would worry about the customer satisfaction, the citizen satisfaction, because it's the citizen who will tell me whether I am delivering or not. If I am purely looking at a performance that is not outcome based, then I'm looking at my targets that I've set internally.
You'll have a service charter.
That, in fact, I will be saying I have done very well. But if I ask the citizen, they'll tell me you haven't. So you see, one, I am measuring my internal processes, and I'm very happy with it, right? But I'm not speaking to the expected outcome from the citizen. That's a clear example of what we're talking about. Let me give you another example. Is where quite recently, because we look at performance in relation to recognizing productivity. Should we pay you a bonus or we shouldn't? And we found, for example, a state corporation who has been ranked very well, and they say, look, we meet the criteria for being bonus. Paid a bonus. But when we looked at their financials, one, they have a pending bill almost hitting 1 billion, right? So why are you being rated very highly and yet you're carrying a pending bill? Why are you being rated highly and you have a deficit? And we said, sorry, we're not going to pay you that bonus. So that's what I mean by what are we measuring? So yes, you have achieved very good. But what did you measure? Very good against what? Exactly. Did you measure outcomes that are productive? That speaks to why you were what is your mandate? Why you're in place in the first time. So that's really the issue. One of the other things you said is culture. Yes. What about culture? Culture, culture speaks to the way we do things. What do we believe in, right? It speaks to our values. It speaks to what we do on a day-to-day. As a nation, the Constitution has defined our values, right? Our national values. But if we ask ourselves today, in fact, if I ask you, can you tell me our national values? Very few of us. I don't know that. You see?
Do you know them? No, but is there any such thing as a national value?
They are in the Constitution. But let me answer him. And then I will take your challenge. Because he asked me, what do we mean? What do we mean here as we look at, as we speak to this subject of wage bill, we have identified 3 areas that we feel strongly we must take it back to the core of who we are at the public service. And that is about accountability. Are we accountable for the public funds? We are entrusted with public funds. So accountability is one that ought to be really in the DNA of a public servant. And that's one. The other one we have said should be at the core is this issue about productivity. If I'm being paid, I ought to do more. I ought to demonstrate that I'm doing what is required of me in that sense, all right? So that's a culture that ought to be core to us. And then the whole area now about productivity and then citizen centricity. We are here to serve the citizens. So we look at those 3 as one of the areas that ought to be at the center of who we are as a public service. And it ought to inform what is our culture. And I know he was asking about culture.
Well, you see why I raised the question?
Yes.
If you look at it in terms of something which over time has been established as the way in which we do things, if I were to say it very broadly, I would say it's dynamic. So when one says that these are our values, they are referring to something that is an accumulation of the past and is being looked at in the present. But do we take into account of how that has evolved over time so that we see what was envisioned and what is, and perhaps look forward and say, what will be, since we're talking outcomes, what will be the outcomes of the actualization of these things that we now call our values?
You've said rightly so. Culture evolves. The question is, is the way we perform our duties in the public service evolving to the requirements of our environment? Are we speaking to the expectations of the citizens today, not yesterday, right? Because the expectations are not what we expected 5, 6, 7 years ago. So you're right that culture evolves, and yes, we might say in the Constitution these are our values, but culture is not static.
No.
It then means, as a public service, we have to have internal processes that allows us to continuously redefine ourselves, redefine what we do.
Yes.
And ensure that everyone in the public service is keeping pace with that expectation. And that's not what is happening.
If I look at the laws that we keep speaking of, and as we practice them, I would argue that most laws are aspirational.
Yes.
They take into account that you are likely not to abide by the laws, but you will keep, and that's why you have a police force. If indeed it was understood that we will obey the law, we would not need a police force. We would just go about our business. And that perhaps is the thinking on which a lot of values are anchored. That this is what we consider adequate and useful for the common good, and there is a path we must follow. But are these paths clear? And the responsibility then that is laid on the shoulders of those who are supposed to ensure that the mandate of these systems are actually brought to bear to bring about the fruition of what was foreseen or envisioned, there seems to be a constant hiccup. Constant. We look at the Ministry of Education, for instance, and the hiccups there. This isn't now a hiccup. It has become a problem that probably needs serious attention. Because if something seems to be discussed and talked about, and when you expect a solution, you're still talking about it. You expect a solution, you're still talking about it. Surely, madam, would this then not be our culture, that we talk about things and we never really do anything serious about it?
You see, one of the core pillars of a culture that's transformational, a culture that evolves with the realities, is the whole issue about leadership, right?
Yes.
It's centered on leadership, because the leader must embody that culture, and they must champion it, and they must live it, and they must demonstrate it on a day-to-day.
And those who report to this leader must also do the same.
Yes, because it is about, leadership is about, a culture is about actually embracing and everyday demonstrating that value. It's not about just saying it. Are you demonstrating that's what you do on an everyday? So it starts with leadership, but then it must then cascade to everybody, so that collectively you do what you say you want to do. But first you must define and get right what you want to do before you say, now let's get there.
But I thought we'd agreed earlier on that this is something we're very good at as a country. Talk about what we need to do, ought to do, and even demonstrating in the written form how we are going to go about it. This we're good at.
Not always. I want to say not always, because I gave you an example of, we've got a very beautiful performance contracting tool.
Yes.
All right? But what are we putting in there? Is it the right thing? Right? So,
which means we are good, just like City is saying, we are good at talking about something, saying that this is what we need to do, attempting to do it, but then we're just ticking the boxes. We're checking box. We need to have, in fact, we pride ourselves because we won a Commonwealth Award for our performance contracting tool, but we don't pride ourselves in looking back and seeing whether it's delivering or not. It is looking back and wondering, so did we get this? Yes, we got it. So what is this that is making the best performing institution best? It's because they have a service charter. It's because they have a call center. It's because they have this and the other. It's because they tick the boxes, but not because the citizens have said that this is actually working for us.
That's true. And what it speaks to that is, to be successful, one has to continuously reassess your assumptions, your plans, because they may have been okay yesterday, but not today, right? And that's what we must be good at. Even as we say we have the right policies, we have the right processes, I challenge to say, when were they done? If you wrote that policy 5 years ago, in this world, 5 years is too long a time, right? You must be in a way be dynamic, very flexible and agile to continuously speak to your changing environment. And I think that's one of the problems sometimes is we have written policies, we have written regulations, but are they keeping pace with our global environment that is moving very fast? So we've got to be more agile and we've got to be more dynamic to relook at what we do, our policies, and challenge ourselves. Are they the best?
Our guest this morning is LYN MENGICH. She's the chairperson of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission. Our conversation is, what do we need to do as a country to get to that level, which is, the required level according to the Public Finance Management Regulations? 35%, not more than 35% of our revenues should go to public wage bill. Currently, with the latest, it's around 47%. We need to cut that back. What we all need to do to get ourselves there. Is everybody reading from the same page? City.
It appears when I look at the leadership, not the current one, leadership in the plural, leadership that we've had, there's what we can call the stated and the intended goal that every government that we've had has, but then something runs interference with these goals. It's like there's what they say and then there's what they do, or what they're allowed to do, or what happens in their time that runs interference with what was said. If I can go back to Kenyatta 1, go back to the Moi era, Kibaki era, and the thing about all these eras is, without a shadow of a doubt, each era was occasioned by some very huge scandal. Something that happened, and the people behind many of these big scandals were people who were in positions of authority, in one or the other. Whether they're talking about the maize scandal in the Kenyatta era that had the name of one Paul Ngei being attached to it, and then you come to the Moi era. Now there, you'll be spoiled for choice as to what you want to pick up, that particular era. Then you come to the Kibaki era, which many tout as being one of the most successful. And yet the scandal, or the scandals then, were some of the hugest the country has ever seen. I say this because when you look at the amounts of monies that are involved in any of these processes, what was said to be the goal or what the government set out to do for the citizenry, and then what happened, and it happened under the auspices of people who had been given the mandate to look after the interests of the people and the public. You then look at the current government and the one before it. It looks like we picked up the pace and we have a completely new paradigm altogether. The things that we thought were humongous in the past pale into significance when you consider some of the things that have been mentioned. You're talking about discussions around state capture. You're talking about discussions about all manner of things that are happening. All these things happen with state coffers. So you have this unfortunate situation where whatever we collect, whatever we make, a huge portion of it, I dare say something like 70% of it, if not more, goes into paying debt. So when we're talking about the things we need to do, it's with only 30% of what remains. Now, it's daunting because we will never then be able to actually achieve. Because the maths that we do have to do with the entirety of our GDP. Now, if already 70% of it is going away to pay debts, and we have 30, when will we ever get to achieve the goals that we set?
Even as you think about that, I mean, if we're looking at the numbers, because this is a numbers game, and I still go back to the fact that 35% is a number that was put there by folks who made the law. And there's a reasoning behind why they did that. So two parts. One, at 47%, down to 35%, if we're able to get down to that number, how much are we looking at in terms of Kenya shillings that could be recovered? With right now where it is at 47%, what's the actual amount of shillings that's being spent to be at 47%? How much would you reduce it by to get to 35?
At the moment, we have actually just hit the 1 trillion mark.
Okay.
In terms of the actual wage bill.
The wage bill.
Right?
Okay.
And that is now the projected for 2022-23. With that projection, the ratio will come down actually to 43% because there is growth in revenue.
Okay.
Right? So we're looking at 43%. We're looking at 1 trillion mark. Now, we're then saying it should, actually the law said not more than. It's not even saying it should be that amount.
Okay.
Right? So for us to get there are two things. One is to assume you will grow your revenue. Right? And we did some projections and said, what would you need to do? You would need to get your revenue to over 4 trillion, almost 4 point something trillion, to get to 35% by 2028. Now, that means you're growing your revenue by over 19%, which we are not. So that tells us that alone is not going to be the answer. It has to be a combination of growing your revenue and also managing your actual wage bill itself.
Managing
and
could include reducing.
That's why. Okay, I'll explain what it means. That's why we're having this wage bill conference, because we are saying you cannot grow revenue by up to 4.1 trillion by 2028, going by the current trends. Therefore, something else must be done. That's why we're convening this wage bill conference from the 15th to 17th of April to bring together all stakeholders. When I mean all stakeholders, it means both the national and the county governments coming together to then say, what do we need to do? Now, this wage bill is convened pursuant to a summit resolution. And as you know, the summit really is convened by both the national and the county governments on issues that are of interest to both levels of government.
Yep.
That summit is chaired by His Excellency the President. So the summit then acknowledged that there is something we need to do. And hence your question is what do we need to do about this revenue? So first of all, the commitment is to get it to not more than 35% by 2028. And that commitment was made. The county governments then are also to align to the same.
Okay.
So what is it that we will be doing at this conference, and what is different? Because we've had conferences.
Similar conversations.
We've had a conference 2 years ago. One of the things is coming to this wage bill conference, every institution has been actually tasked to develop strategies and plans to get to 35%. So we are not convening on an empty slate. Everybody has developed those strategies. Some of them can see how they can get there. Some of them are still saying it is a huge challenge. So as they come into this conference, is to be able to see from other countries, because we've got experiences from South Africa, from Malaysia, to also learn from other institutions in Kenya that are saying, yes, we think we can get to that 35%, listen to the conversations and refine their strategies. So that to us is fundamentally different. We're not convening a conference on an empty place. You come in with something, you go out having refined your plans with that commitment to get to the 28 to 35 by 2028.
Okay. May I ask?
Yes.
You did say, I believe it was last month actually, that Kenya living beyond its means is one of the major contributors to this high wage bill. The assumption is that everybody is going to do what they should do to make sure that things are tight and in place. But the reality is that the majority of people in these offices, majority of people who have the luxury of expense, are not doing what they should do, not cutting a coat according to cloth, not doing what they're supposed to do. I remember my father used to say that you have freedoms. But when we find that you are not able to operate within those freedoms in the way in which you ought to, we shall curtail those freedoms, or at the very least, we shall introduce disciplinary action to make sure that you do what you're supposed to do. It does feel an awful lot as though those who spend the money, those who waste, are being coddled to the point whereby they feel as though nothing will be done. And this is the result that we see. There's wastage, people do as they want, and they come and give an explanation later, and we have a wage bill that's above 1 trillion shillings, and it needn't be there. So why don't we see a sterner approach to dealing with this wastage that is evident to everyone? It's evident.
So whereas I agree with the fact that there is some element of wastage, I want to go back to my initial conversation at the beginning, which was, let's remember, one is that this wage bill is a balance between delivering services and also managing the wage bill. So a lot of the wage bill we are seeing is actually not wastage, and I did share. There is a wage bill that we must incur. That does not rule out that there is some element of wastage. Secondly is to recognize that it has been coming down, right? The wage bill has come down. In 2021, we were at 54%. We know partly, of course, it is COVID, so you would expect revenues went down, so automatically the ratio went down. But even if we go back to 2018, it was at 51%. So first, let's acknowledge that there is a trend that it is coming down, and that we are not just sitting pretty and saying, let's just keep consuming. No, there is a lot of work.
The percentage is coming down.
Yes.
The absolute figure is not.
Yes. However, let me share some statistics that will tell you why the absolute figure per employee, when we look at the wage bill per employee, has only been growing by 2%. Right? 2%. Whereas the overall wage bill in absolute amount is growing by over 10%. That tells you that that growth is attributed to employee numbers, not the actual.
We're hiring more people.
Yes, it's not the actual earnings.
Yep.
The actual take home.
Yep.
It is the hiring. So when you look at that hiring, the majority will be in the sectors that I mentioned. However, we are still concerned that there is some hiring that is not necessarily in those key sectors. And that is where we need to address ourselves.
Okay.
Right? Say, do we really need to continue hiring in sectors that are not core and are not critical? That's one of the actual focus of the Wage Bill Conference. It's one of the pillars. By day 3, we must have a resolution.
We must have a conversation about, do you, Lynn, actually see a situation where all these agencies that will be sitting in that conference coming to say we are going to cut back our excess fat by letting go of some workers?
The conversation is not about letting off necessarily, because we're struggling with unemployment, right? So this is not a conversation about letting off. We are already struggling with unemployment. The conversation is be more productive. If we are more productive, we will actually increase employment opportunities in the country, not just in the public service. So we want to shift the conversation to, it's not about cutting your staff complement. It's about, can you do more with what you have, right? If we can do more with what you have, we will be more productive.
So what are we going to be using as a measure of, yes, you can do more? Because people will come and tell you, we're going to do more. In fact, we're going to have a hiring freeze in these areas, these departments, because we already have a staff complement that can work around these areas. How are we going to tell that just by coming and telling us that we shall actually hit our 2027 target?
It's very good that this conversation is actually happening when government just launched the MTP4, the medium-term plan, just last week, a week ago. And there are very, very clear targets on what we need to achieve. So the conversation will be, you achieve those targets without necessarily saying, for me to achieve, I need more, right? How can you achieve those very same targets? and they're very, very clear targets. We should be able to achieve that with our current headcount, except for the critical sectors that I've mentioned. And that's the conversation that we will be having, is that you've got very clear targets, but typically most people will say, look, for me to achieve this, I need more. I need to recruit more.
Madam, is this the first time we're having these medium-term goals in the country?
No, that's why it is the fourth.
Yes. Now, if it's the fourth, I take the view that we will be drawing from our experiences of the past and looking at what those previous goals were and how far we got with them. So what we're looking at now is a accumulation of perhaps goals that were not achieved, and we're talking about how best we can achieve these goals.
Of course, this document belongs to the National Treasury, so I'm not best to say that. However, I want to say it is based on Vision 2030. It is not based on history. In fact, if you look at those documents, it's all looking at, this is Vision 2030, this is what we set ourselves to do. And therefore, to get there, what do we need to do? So it is vision, it is not history.
Actually, history plays a very important part in the vision, because it tells us how far we are from what is envisioned.
Yes, and if there is a gap, then you will be saying we must do much, much more, not only to achieve the vision, but to catch up on the gaps that you have.
You launched an integrated devolution data portal together with the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. Now, given the mandate that was this article called Article 216 gives you, it's your mandate. Has that portal been useful in trying to... Okay, you know where I'm going with this, so just continue.
That portal, it is not SRC, that is the control of budget.
Yes.
So that's not within our mandate.
Yes.
So I'll not be able to speak much about it, because that's not within our mandate.
That's not within your mandate.
Control of budget. I want to ask some specific questions as we are coming towards the close on what has been in the public discourse. One of them has been privatization of parastatals. Of course, then that would remove some huge wage bill from the books of government, right? If some of these parastatals went. And you even commented on that. Are some of these state corporations being as productive as they should be? Do you think this is a direction that could also help in getting us towards the 35% if we got some parastatals off government?
Absolutely. Why I'm clear about that is, within these state corporations, there are duplication of roles. There are overlaps in roles and functions. And it's not just about state corporations. We find the same between the national and the county governments. So one of the conversations in the Wage Bill Conference is to frankly speak about these duplications, about this overlap of roles and mandates. And you will also see that between some ministries and some independent commissions. So yes, by looking at duplication, overlaps of functions and roles, it will contribute significantly in managing the wage bill. Whether that means that some state corporations are merged or what happens, there has to be that conversation. And I'm sure we have all been part of this conversation. We have seen the commitment by government to actually look at this issue, especially in the state corporations. We are saying, as we come to this conference, that conversation must also include national and county governments, those duplications that we see there, so that we don't leave the conversation to what we see within the state corporations. Yes.
Retirement age, should it come down? It's currently at 60 years in public service. Should it come down to 55, where it used to be?
There are two things to look at. First of all, what is the normal? What's the common trend worldwide? Okay, because that gives us a benchmark to speak to, and it's roughly about the 60%. Of course, there are some countries where there is no retirement age. There is nothing like that. I think the conversation should be what works for Kenya. What works for us as a country. If you say people retire at 55, that means they are pensionable at 55. And yet these are people who are still productive. They can still contribute effectively to the country. So what really is, what's the benefit of saying let's reduce the retirement age? When you have a productive workforce, you make them pensioners and dependent on everybody, is that the right thing to do? Or is it in fact saying, 60 is still productive and they can continue working? So for me, the conversation is more about, do we want to incur a higher pension liability? It's already a huge liability. Are these Kenyans still productive? The answer is yes. So why do you want to retire them early when they can still contribute to the nation? Yes.
Shall we come to a point where the Salaries and Remuneration Commission actually comes up with recommendations that are followed without question? Most of the times when you see, Salaries and Remuneration Commission has said, let's cut back on allowances for these workers, let's cut back on, in-service allowance and all, there's always pushback.
No, it's not just a pushback, it's a huge pushback.
It's vehement.
It's rejected.
Rejection.
Rejection does not mean not implemented, right? I'll give you an example. In the last remuneration review cycle, we did abolish some allowances for members of parliament, for MCAs, for ministers then, right? And yes, there was some resistance, but they were abolished, right? So the message is the fact that there is resistance does not necessarily mean that it will not be implemented.
So even the non-practice allowance for doctors and lawyers will also be implemented?
That's a matter before court. That's a matter before court, so I will not comment on it. So there are some for sure that will be resisted. They go to court, and that one now is determined by court. We will respect.
Okay.
But I can tell you that, yes, we get a lot of resistance, but there is a lot more that is implemented, and it has helped to actually help us to be where we would be. Otherwise, I can tell you the wage bill would not be anywhere near where we are today if we did not have the commission in place.
LYN MENGICH, thank you very much for joining us. LYN is the chairperson of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, speaking to us ahead of the Wage Bill Conference that's going to be from the 15th to the 17th
of April. At the Bomas of Kenya. Yes, we will have those conversations.
We will be watching and seeing what actually comes out of it. 47% of our revenues going into wage bill, and yet 70%, close to 80% of our revenues goes into debt. There's already a conflict here. We don't even know where do you get the 47% from. But we'll talk about that as we head closer to that conference. Keep it here for more conversations.